Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to get through this thing called life. My first research job was in San Diego, in a group of scientists from various disciplines. It was a friendly enough group, and occasionally did things socially, but I knew I needed to make friends outside of work as well. I'd been a student up until then, and since I was working on a university campus, it was easy enough to find out about student groups, many of which were open to the public. Soon enough, I found one that suited me just fine, and where I was welcomed, and that was a group of students and others who enjoyed reading science fiction. They had a lending library with a growing number of books, and on Thursday evenings they went to a local restaurant. Along with other social occasions such as movie nights and holiday parties, spending time in the company of people with whom I shared interests certainly contributed to my happiness. Still, I realized I needed something more than that. While training as a scientist and going all the way back to high school, I pretty much avoided anything to do with religion. For 15 years, I simply hadn't been interested. But there, in California, perhaps because I was no longer a student and had more time, I started to get interested in religion again. Not the child-friendly Bible stories and vanilla Christianity of my childhood, but earth-centered spirituality, the scientific creation story of the universe, and ultimately, of course, Unitarian Universalism. Now, there is a UU congregation in San Diego, but it was a long bus ride for me to get there, and they didn't have the local branches that they do now. And I'd connected with a newly formed group calling itself the World Pantheist Movement, which promoted a science-based spirituality in which nature is of primary importance, though all of its activities took place online. I wanted face-to-face conversations like I had with the science fiction group. I wanted to get out and enjoy nature like I did with the Sierra Club, but I also wanted to talk about religion and spirituality. Thankfully, there were a number of people on the Pantheism email list who lived in Southern California, and I guess they wanted much the same thing, since it proved quite easy to start finding times and places to meet. Looking back now, I realize we were all experiencing a basic common human need. I think it's a big reason why congregations exist. There's a general impulse for people to gather in groups around common needs, concerns, and interests. That's foundational not just to intellectual well-being and emotional health, but also to physical survival. But there's also a religious impulse to want to gather not simply in Prince's words to get through this thing called life, but also to try to make sense of life, to find meaning in it, to respond to existential dread by receiving and offering comfort, by sharing and thereby multiplying the joys and wonder of being alive. I think this is the primary reason why people, given the freedom to do so, may seek out some form of religious community. So how do we reconcile this basic need with the data that says that church attendance, by which is usually meant people going to mainline Christian churches, has been in steady decline, particularly amongst younger generations? There's lots being written about this fact for obvious reasons. One big piece of it, as most people recognize, is that going to church is no longer a common social expectation. In the first half of the 20th century, up through the peak of church attendance in the 1950s, businesses, civic groups, the media, government, even schools promoted the idea that to be a good citizen, you also had to be a good church member. Churches never had to work to bring people into their sanctuaries on a Sunday morning, thanks to society doing their evangelism for them. Rather, when people go to church today, when they keep going to church. It's in large part for the community. Often people say that their congregation feels like family, which one assumes is in reference to ideas about what makes a healthy family rather than a dysfunctional one. But at the end of the day, as pointed out in a recent article by Lutheran minister Eric Parker, though churches should be communities where we feel connected to each other in deep ways, family and community are still social commitments. Yes, once a newcomer is past that initial excitement of discovering a place like this, where they finally feel that what they believe doesn't make them an outsider, it's forming connections and making friends and getting involved in deeper ways that keeps them coming back. But in thinking about what drives people to look for a church, Parker claims that there's more to it than just wanting to be part of a community of shared interests. After all, there are many ways it's possible to do that these days, from soccer teams to book clubs, from hiking groups to brunch meetups. But here's a helpful analogy. Imagine, Parker suggests, someone showing up for a soccer team that stopped playing soccer years ago, that instead gathers for coffee and donuts. But this gathering of people still calls themselves a soccer team. Imagine, he continues, members of that soccer team wringing their hands week after week over the fact that nobody wants to join their team to pick up the donuts. You can see, Parker notes, why soccer players looking for an actual soccer team wouldn't join. In Parker's experience as a Lutheran, what drove him and his peers to go to church is wanting to follow Jesus. And so they looked for churches that are committed to following Jesus. If instead they found a church that's more focused on trendy programs and amped up music and flashy worship spaces and hip ministers with tattoos, well, they felt like soccer players finding a soccer team that doesn't actually play soccer. Why would they join? That's all well and good for a Lutheran. It makes sense that church for a Lutheran is about a commitment to follow Jesus. And while that might work for some individual Unitarian Universalists, it does not translate to Unitarian Universalism in general. And I would argue it doesn't make as much sense for the wider population in today's world either. For one thing, there's a huge theological problem with making Jesus the singular focus of church, even for a Christian church. You might have heard me put this into words before in terms of the big difference between the religion of Jesus and a religion about Jesus. But if soccer can be used as an analogy for church, then let me use an idea from Buddhism to talk about Jesus. Imagine coming to a river. You need to get across to the other side, but the river's too deep to wade through, too wide to swim across. But you find a boat. And once you figure out how to use the boat, you do the work necessary to get across the river. Since your goal all along has been to get to the other side of the river, then the boat was simply a means to that end, to help you cross the obstacle of the river. Now, in Mahayana Buddhism, the boat is a metaphor for the religion itself, Mahayana actually meaning great vehicle. And the point is that once you've used the boat to get across the river, once you've used the vehicle to get you where you need to go, you don't need it anymore. But imagine finding the boat, and rather than putting it to its intended use to cross the river, you become so enthralled with the boat itself, so enamored with it, that you just sit in it, enjoying your personal relationship with the boat, perhaps even worshipping the boat. Well, if you do that, you will obviously never reach the other side of the river. You might be happy in the boat. You might even find deep fulfillment, but only by ignoring the real purpose of the boat as a means to cross the river. The huge theological problem is that while the religion of Jesus is crossing the river, a religion about Jesus is worshipping the boat. Now, according to the New Testament book named John, Jesus says, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." But the whole purpose of a way is to get somewhere else. To switch metaphors, doorways are essential for getting from one side of a wall to the other, for example. And the purpose of a doorway is clearly not to stay in it. Getting stuck in a doorway is a problem. So if we're talking about getting somewhere, whether in terms of a boat in Buddhism or Jesus as the way in Christianity, where is it that they're trying to take us? Using the vehicle of religion, what destination are we trying to reach? I'm convinced that the goal of religion, and not just Unitarian Universalism, but in fact every religion, is beloved community. It's a goal in the sense of something that we're trying to reach. It's not something we're supposed to worship, in the traditional sense of worshipping something. It would obviously be quite ridiculous if I were to stand up here and lead us in a prayer that begins, "O great beloved community without whom we are as naught." So let's talk about what it is and why it matters. First, the noun, community. That's essential both for what we're trying to achieve and for how we're trying to get there. Having fellow travellers and companions makes a huge difference when we're on a difficult journey. And it underscores the point that Samantha Boardman made in the readings, that much of being happy comes down to less me and more we. As she noted, generosity and social support are two of the biggest predictors of well-being. What's more, community doesn't just help us feel better, it's absolutely essential. There's a famous public service announcement produced by the Partnership for a Drug-Free America that showed a laboratory rat in a cage, alone but for 2 water bottles. One bottle held plain water, the other a solution of a drug such as cocaine. The PSA showed that the rat became addicted to the drugged water and kept coming back for more and more until inevitably it died. The message was that drugs can do the same to humans. Well, some drugs are highly addictive, and there's a genetic predisposition to addiction, but maybe there are other factors at work too. Bruce Alexander is a research psychologist who wondered about the fact that the rat was all alone in the cage and didn't have anything to do but drink from one bottle or the other. He wondered what would happen if the rat wasn't all alone. So he built what he called Rat Park. More than an empty cage for an isolated rat, this was a habitat with toys and tunnels and other rats. Both water bottles were still present, one with plain water and the other drugged, and though the rats tried them both, they generally avoided the drugged water. They did not become addicted to it, and none of them died from it. Now, humans are social animals too, so think about how that applies to us. We do better when we're with other people in a supportive environment. We do better at dealing with difficulty and stress if we're with other people who can help us. Being isolated, being disconnected from our fellow humans, particularly if we're in a stressful situation, isn't good for us and may even kill us. Being connected, being in community, well, that can save your life. And that brings us to the adjective beloved. We're not talking about any old type of community, after all. We're talking about a commonwealth of radical love and justice, a world in which everyone is truly loved for their inherent worth and dignity, a world in which, to put it simply, all 7 of our 7 principles are not merely hopeful aspirations, but are manifestly real. Congregations have a vital role to play in this, of course, by offering in their communities a taste of the beloved community. As I talked about a few weeks ago, churches and other religious communities exist to change lives, to help us help one another to grow into our better selves and make the world a better place, with the goal being beloved community. This is essentially what our own mission statement says. The mission of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of the Peninsula is to create a dynamic community that celebrates life and searches for truths. It would be preferable if the word justice were an explicit part of that, but at least it's implied. But here's an increasingly important piece of this. The vital role that congregations need to play includes opposing the ongoing privatization of society, because a privatized society is the opposite of a commonwealth. I really doubt there's any great conspiracy that seeks to replace democracy with feudalism, but we really do need to ask what's happening to our public institutions and why. Public schools have been set up for failure through high-stakes testing. Public utilities are being destroyed, not just in Flint, Michigan, but in countless cities that are, if not targets of deliberate sabotage, then at least victims of criminal negligence. Public lands are exposed to mining and logging, and public libraries have always been attacked by people who only believe in the First Amendment when it's convenient, whereas the Second Amendment is sacrosanct, even if it means, for instance, the end of public universities. As Philip Nell of Kansas State University noted recently, a new law will make Kansas the 9th state to invite guns into classrooms, dormitories, libraries, laboratories, and offices. Before the Virginia Tech massacre, only Utah required colleges and universities to allow guns on their campuses. And with even more mass shootings since then, Kansas will now be the 9th state to do so, thanks to what is unbelievably called the Kansas Personal and Family Protection Act. As Nell sadly concludes, when your state legislature threatens to kill you and your students, then it's time to look for a new job. The whole point of public institutions is to help people help themselves up. Without them, there's no middle class. Without public institutions, there'll only be the 1%, or the 0.1%, or the 0.01% versus everybody else in poverty. The church has an essential role to play in preventing that from happening, by proclaiming the beloved community, by making a commitment to realize a commonwealth of radical love and justice for everybody. Here, we express that commitment most obviously through our work with the Boys and Girls Club and Port and St. Paul's and Clean the Bay and Pride. But even things that might seem like the complete opposite of getting out into the world and making a difference, namely our new bylaws, are an important piece of our commitment to beloved community. And the fact that more than half of our members, a majority of you, came to vote on the bylaws last month bears witness to that, I think. We still need to get the new governance structure up and running, of course. Merely having new bylaws won't make that happen automatically. But we must always remember that the whole reason that we're even doing this is so that we can better serve our mission, to act on our commitment to realize a commonwealth of radical love and justice for everybody. Bylaws, governance structures, this fellowship, Unitarian Universalism, all of them are vehicles to help us overcome the obstacles that stand between today's world and tomorrow's beloved community. So, dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to get through this thing called life. Let us direct our energies so that life is not merely something to be endured, but something to be celebrated. Let us work together to lift one another up, to express not only through words, but more importantly through deeds, a message of love and hope that overflows our walls and spreads out through the streets and neighborhoods and cities beyond. Let us remember that we are better together, that this thing called life is a tremendous gift we have been invited to receive, and gratefully share with one another. So may it be.